My husband screamed, "Shut up! Who asked you?" in front of our closest friends. I stood up and walked away without shedding a single tear. He thought I was embarrassed. He had no idea I had already made a decision that would destroy the life he thought he controlled. Welcome to the revenge tales. And this story keeps the promise in its title because what happened the next morning changed everything. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'd love to know who's in our community. I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway of the custom suburban home my husband had designed as a monument to his own ego. Below me, the hum of the dinner party had decayed into an awkward, suffocating silence, but my pulse remained entirely steady. Anger was not loud this time. It was strictly clinical. I slipped quietly into the bedroom of my 14-year-old daughter, Maya. She was curled up on her window seat, hiding beneath a pair of heavy, noise-canceling headphones. I gently pulled them back, and she looked up at me with red, exhausted eyes. What she said next dismantled the final, brittle threads of my patience. She confessed, her voice shaking, that if marriage meant disappearing into the background and enduring daily cruelty, she never wanted to get married. The realization hit me like physical ice. For 15 years, I had practiced the art of becoming an invisible ghost in my own house. I had always rationalized this functional dissociation as a necessary sacrifice. I convinced myself that my strategic accommodation was keeping the peace. What people often misunderstand about long-term emotional erasure is that silence is rarely a sign of passive weakness. It is an invisible chain of learned survival. It is a highly calculated defense mechanism deployed to maintain household stability. I made myself invisible, not out of cowardice, but to serve as a shock absorber, shielding my child from the collateral damage of a fragile man's temper until the precise exit window presented itself. But looking at Maya's shattered expression, the truth became undeniable. My 15 years of mechanical compliance had not protected her. It had actively normalized psychological abuse. It was teaching her to accept degradation as the baseline for love. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon some lingering trace of marital regret, but there was only absolute clarity. I had been the silent investor in his fabricated version of a family, subsidizing his grand illusions with my own erasure. Love had devolved into an unrewarding subscription, and I had been quietly footing the emotional bill for over a decade. I did not cry. I did not ask the universe what I had done to deserve this treatment. Instead, I sat beside my daughter, smoothed her hair, and promised her that things were going to change immediately. This was no longer just a domestic dispute over respect. It was a hostile takeover. I had to break this generational trauma cycle tonight before my child absorbed the toxic lie that a woman's worth is determined by her capacity to endure disrespect. I kissed her forehead, walked back to my room, and began to outline the systematic execution of my departure. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing off the noise of the house. I sat at my desk in the dark, the faint glow of the streetlights illuminating my hands. They were perfectly steady. I was no longer a wife grieving a broken partnership. I was a forensic auditor examining a bankrupt institution. The ledger of our lives had been deeply unbalanced for far too long, and it was time to collect the principal. At 5:30 the next morning, the heavy front door slammed shut. Travis left for his senior partnership at the architectural firm, acting with his usual arrogant swagger, assuming my silence at the breakfast table was simply a return to routine compliance. The moment his luxury car pulled out of the driveway, I did not break down. I did not waste a single second weeping into my coffee cup. I walked straight to the kitchen counter, opened my encrypted laptop, and initiated the retaliation. Throughout our 15-year marriage, I had maintained my own career, advancing over the past 5 years into a clinical forensic medical billing specialist work Travis routinely degraded as my charity hobby. What he did not know was that this role had allowed me to quietly funnel $3,000 a month into a private, independent reserve. I executed the transfer immediately. $180,000 of independently earned capital moved cleanly into a separate, high-yield account under my legal name, fully documented and backed by 5 years of verified personal tax records. With my operational funding secure, I turned my attention to the marital balance sheet. I pulled 15 years of digital bank statements, tax returns, and utility invoices. I highlighted every single mortgage payment, every property tax bill, and every maintenance invoice I had personally reconciled while Travis lived entirely inside his performative provider fantasy. We lived in a $1,850,000 estate, and the paper trail proved, indisputably, that my steady income and meticulous management had carried the vast majority of our real domestic overhead. He had built his entire external identity on being the sole king of his castle, never once realizing the castle was heavily subsidized by the queen he publicly humiliated. I cross-referenced the accounts, organizing the data into pristine, undeniable spreadsheets. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of aggressive accounting. Every cruel remark, every dismissive wave of his hand was systematically quantified and balanced against the financial reality of our existence. I printed the ledgers, slipping them into a thick, leather-bound folder. The silent morning hours stretched on, the house completely still around me. I felt no panic, no hesitation. The lingering fog of emotional attachment had burned away, leaving behind a cold, mechanical precision. By the time the clock struck 9, the foundational pillars of his empire had been completely severed. He was walking around his prestigious office, barking orders and projecting dominance, completely unaware that his kingdom had already been legally and financially repossessed. I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise in the morning light. The quiet satisfaction of compiling the truth was intoxicating. Travis had spent 15 years treating our marriage like a corporation where he was the permanent chief executive and I was an expendable intern, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of power. He assumed the person talking the loudest held all the leverage. He never understood that the person managing the daily ledgers, the one silently processing the liabilities and allocating the assets, was the one who truly controlled the board. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the empty kitchen. The preliminary audit was complete, and the evidence was bulletproof. Over the next 2 weeks, the domestic atmosphere grew increasingly toxic. Travis interpreted my quiet, methodical demeanor not as tactical preparation, but as total, broken surrender. He assumed he had successfully reestablished the hierarchy, and this delusion emboldened him. The escalation was swift and merciless. He began returning home late, reeking of single-barrel bourbon and cheap cigars. He would strut into the kitchen, mock my evening routines, and make passive-aggressive jabs about my career in front of Maya. When I calmly refused to attend his upcoming corporate networking mixer, his mask of civilized charm completely slipped. He sneered, leaning over the granite island, and reminded me that I was incredibly lucky he allowed me to live in a custom home designed by an award-winning architect. He threatened, his voice dripping with venom, that if I ever stepped out of line again, I would find myself on the street with absolutely nothing. He thought his intimidation tactics were breaking my spirit, but I was simply using every insult as vital calibration data. I maintained absolute emotional detachment. I stopped making his morning coffee. I stopped ensuring his tailored suits were dry cleaned. The mechanical duties I had performed for a decade and a half ceased completely. Yet he was too absorbed in his own grandiosity to notice the subtle withdrawal of my labor. I observed him the way a scientist observes a volatile specimen, noting his weaknesses, mapping his blind spots. The more hostile he became, the more he proved that he possessed zero remorse and zero capacity for self-reflection. This relentless cruelty functioned as my green light, removing any lingering moral hesitation I might have harbored about destroying his life. Every evening, while he drank himself into an arrogant stupor in his home office, I sat in the living room and continued to fortify my exit strategy. I reviewed the financial blueprints, confirming every calculation, ensuring there were no loose ends that his expensive lawyers could exploit. He was actively testing exactly how far he could push before I finally cracked. He believed he was systematically dismantling my self-esteem, but in reality, he was just providing the exact atmospheric pressure I needed to forge my resolve into diamonds. The silence between us was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an oppressed wife. It was the lethal, patient silence of a predator waiting for the optimal moment to strike. He had mistaken my stillness for defeat, profoundly unaware that I was operating on a completely different battlefield. I watched him pace the hallway one evening, boasting loudly on the phone to Marcus about his latest commercial contract. He looked so incredibly fragile, beneath his tailored clothes, a hollow man propped up by stolen confidence and unpaid emotional debts. I did not interrupt him. I did not argue. I just let him keep talking, letting him inflate his ego to maximum capacity. The higher he allowed himself to float on his own fabricated superiority, the more devastating the inevitable impact with reality would be. My exit window was rapidly approaching, and I was more than ready. The conflict rapidly shifted from a toxic domestic dispute into a highly professional escalation. I contacted my trusted lifelong confidant, Sabrina, who immediately recognized the severity of the situation. She connected me with Dr. Evelyn Vance, a clinical psychologist specializing in covert domestic control, and recommended an elite, ruthless forensic divorce attorney. In Dr. Vance's discreet, sunlit office, I began the critical work of psychological deconstruction. She validated the clinical reality of my situation, helping me process the hard truth that self-erasure was not a noble sacrifice. It was a slow suicide. Armed with this emotional sovereignty, I met with my legal team. The strategy moved from defensive to offensive. My attorney drafted formal legal preservation notices and initiated a comprehensive cross-referencing of Travis's firm distribution accounts against our marital tax filings. I spent 3 grueling days in a secure conference room, methodically assembling 3 massive binders of bulletproof evidence. But during a deep dive into the co-signed tax schedules, I uncovered a glaring, fatal anomaly. Travis had assumed I would never possess the financial literacy to understand his corporate maneuvers. He was wrong. Through his partnership Schedule K-1 forms and co-signed corporate filings, I traced a shadow transaction buried beneath routine expense declarations. It was a staggering, unauthorized diversion. $120,000 of his firm's client operating funds had been secretly routed through a speculative offshore account. Travis had systematically falsified our domestic write-offs, covering his tracks by telling his senior business partner, Marcus, that I was drastically overspending on household maintenance to cover the shortfall. I stared at the highlighted ledger lines, the magnitude of his betrayal washing over me. This was the ultimate kill shot. The conflict was no longer just about a narcissistic husband projecting a false domestic illusion. Travis had committed highly actionable corporate embezzlement. He was not just an arrogant spouse. He was a liability, a criminal, whose reckless financial sabotage compromised his entire firm's legal standing. Any microscopic fragment of pity I might have reserved for the father of my child evaporated instantly. He had weaponized my reputation to cover his own felony. I handed the printed routing numbers to my attorney, who reviewed the documents with a predatory smile. We had him completely cornered. The stakes had elevated to a criminal level, severing any remaining pathway to redemption or negotiation. I locked the binders into my briefcase, the weight of the evidence grounding me. The legal net had been expertly woven, reinforced with irrefutable data, and cast wide. Travis was still swimming in circles, admiring his own reflection in the water, entirely oblivious to the fact that the trap had already closed around him. He thought we were heading toward a messy, emotional separation. He had no idea he was walking straight into a meticulously planned corporate and financial execution. I left the lawyer's office that afternoon and walked out into the brisk city air. The heavy burden of compliance I had carried for 15 years had been entirely replaced by cold, calculated anticipation. I had transformed my pain into a weapon of precision. I was no longer the victim of his fragile ego. I was the architect of his impending downfall. All that remained was to deliver the final verdict. The climax arrived on a Friday evening. Travis, fueled by an inflated sense of victory over a pending commercial contract, insisted on hosting Marcus and his wife, Elena, for a celebratory dinner in our private dining lounge. The mahogany table was set with heavy silver and expensive crystal. The atmosphere was thick with Travis's suffocating bravado. Midway through the main course, fueled by 3 glasses of expensive wine, Travis turned his verbal aggression directly onto Maya. He mocked her academic interests, calling them mediocre, and loudly declared that she was destined to hit the exact same ambition ceiling as her mother. The cruelty was so casual, so profoundly toxic, that Marcus finally put his wine glass down with a sharp clink and ordered Travis to stop. I did not hesitate. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. Travis glared at me, leaning back in his chair, and shouted his standard tired script. He sneered that I had no money, no leverage, and that I would inevitably starve on the street within a single week without his financial protection. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out the thick-bound forensic dossier, and dropped it directly onto the floral centerpiece. The heavy thud rattled the crystal glasses. Inside was not just our joint marital audit, but the certified copies of the cross-reference tax filings my attorney had prepared for official disclosure. I wasn't making an empty scene. I was executing a formal pre-litigation notice. You spent 15 years convincing yourself I was nothing without you, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. The tragedy is, you were the only one who believed the lie. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the exposed financial summaries and the undeniable proof of the offshore corporate diversions. The reality of the fragile illusion of borrowed grandeur shattered instantly. Narcissistic grandiosity always masquerades as true competence. But when an individual builds their entire identity solely on the performative role of the provider, they panic the moment the unacknowledged partner controls the operational foundation. The extreme volume of Travis's public rage was directly proportional to his internal, pathetic inadequacy. Marcus saw the embezzlement numbers. His face turned ashen. Travis froze, the blood draining from his face as his eyes darted from the folder to Marcus, the terror of total social and professional exposure paralyzing him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His kingdom was evaporating in real time. I turned my back on the wreckage. Maya was already waiting by the door, her coat in hand. We walked out the front doors of the Oak Ridge residence together, leaving behind the suffocating weight of the past. A private town car was idling in the driveway, waiting to carry us toward our new life. As the car pulled away, I did not look back at the grand, empty monument to his ego. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and the execution was flawless. I watched the suburban streetlights fade behind us, replaced by the open road. Travis was left sitting at the head of a ruined table, utterly stripped of his power, his partnership, and his carefully curated social standing. The man who had demanded my silence had finally been silenced by the only language he truly understood: indisputable, catastrophic facts. The ledger was closed. The legal reckoning was swift and devoid of emotion. In the cold, sterile environment of the formal mediation conference room, facts brutally replaced feelings. Travis arrived with highly expensive legal counsel, attempting to aggressively demand full ownership of the Oak Ridge residence, clinging to the delusion that I was merely a dependent. My lawyer did not argue. She simply slid the forensic trace of all $1,850,000 in marital assets across the table, proving my direct capital contributions. Then, she presented the $120,000 corporate embezzlement trace. Faced with immediate criminal exposure and a catastrophic fallout from Marcus, Travis's defense instantly collapsed. Marcus forced him into a heavily discounted partnership buyout to legally insulate the firm. Travis was forced into an entirely equitable settlement. He managed to keep the massive, echoing house, but he kept it completely alone, buried under suffocating maintenance costs he could no longer afford without my silent financial subsidies. On the sunlit steps of the courthouse, after the decree was finalized, Travis stopped me. He looked older, broken, stripped of his artificial grandeur. He asked his final, desperate question: "Why didn't you fight for us?" I looked at him with utter stillness, feeling a profound, untouchable peace. "I did fight," I replied evenly. "I just stopped fighting for you." Maya and I settled into a beautiful, light-filled top-floor apartment near the park. It was a space filled with laughter, fresh air, and unbroken serenity. I've come to realize that choosing the sovereignty of walking away is never a failure of loyalty. It is the ultimate act of maternal courage and personal renewal. We built a sanctuary that no one can ever diminish. Walking away with factual clarity will always be infinitely more powerful than staying trapped in emotional chaos. Choosing to protect your peace is never a defeat, it is the ultimate victory. Your silence can be your strategy, and your exit can be your masterpiece. If this story felt like a mirror to your own journey, subscribe to the Revenge Tales family, share this with someone who needs the courage to choose their peace, and let us know your story down below.